Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are here in Springfield Armory, National Historic Site. We can see here the world's largest collection of historic American firearms. This is located in Springfield, Massachusetts. So as you can see, this is the outside. Now come and join me to see what's inside and explore the first federal armory and one of the first factories in the United States dedicated to the manufacture of weapons. So this is the entrance. Hi.
So we'll walk you through like the buildup of the armory along with our history, and then this side is primarily our firearm collection. So you'll see firearm development and as it occurs.
Nice.
Yep, it's all just this one area.
Okay.
Yeah, let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. Big one.
Yep, yes, I do.
We had a lower water shops, a middle water shops, and upper water shops, and each time they closed the shop, they had an auction. Well, this is what they were doing in that building.
So those giant presses.
Yes.
So they just basically take a piece of bronze or whatever, press a...
Well, by this time, this is 1962. They were even ramping down production because in 1962 there was the M16, and it wasn't being made here, and it was certainly tested here. That's why you see all those old Stockers and ARs. There's a million of those things and pieces of them on the upper floors. So a lot of people think, oh, 1962 they came out. No, they were testing them here in 1958.
Right, yeah.
So they weren't good. Right. When they sold these things, even as it was 1962, they auctioned them. They auctioned them all over the world, Smith & Wesson, everywhere. Because even if you computerize it, you still need a billion tons of force coming down on this product. Doesn't matter. Yeah. I'm sure they still get used one way or another.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they've got machines that are making accents that are 100 years old. You can't buy parts off anymore, and nobody makes anything like that anymore.
That's what they have.
Thank you so much for your help. That was so cool.
No problem at all. Yeah, this is all right.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Take care.
So this is the example of video test and experiment. So let's try it.
My name is Stanley Desmond. In 1940, the government was looking for die and tool makers. So I filled out an application and sent it in. At the Armory at that time, there were a lot of old-timers, and I was on the young side. It wasn't too long before I was holding my own. The old-timers were a little reluctant because there had never been a colored die and tool maker there. Some would make this part of the gun, another would make another part of the gun. Developing the tools to make these components, that was part of my work. My write-up was to develop, fabricate, and make these dies. That was it. I worked with Mr. Scissor. He would make sketches for me. He would put the dimensions on the sketches. And it was for me to interpret and to make the progressive dies.
Modification. As you can see, this is the organ of muskets.
Good afternoon, everybody. In just a moment, we're going to Scott. We'll give a presentation on the M1 rifle, the historic main battle rifle of World War II and the Korean War. It's going to happen over by the Blanchard Lathe, the big machine that's on the right-hand side of the room as you walk in. So if you want to make your way over there, the presentation is going to happen in just a moment. So you're not expecting, no one's going to actually hit somebody that far. But like out to 1,000 yards, a good marksman can probably do that. Up to from 0 to like hello.
Hi.
600 or 700, pretty doable, right? So it's like an accurate long distance firearm. But what you're doing with these things is you're harnessing an explosion, right? Because the gunpowder is exploding and it's turning from a solid to a gas and it's pushing that projectile out. And so if there's heat and pressure and all kinds of things happening in here, and you need all your components and your mechanisms to like seal well and be strong and have the right metallurgy in there to not fail with these extreme conditions that they're undergoing. And so the bolt action in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s is like the sort of tried and true mechanism to harness all these things. You can make it into a repeater, right, pretty easily. So you have a magazine here, which actually, and you can see there's like, we won't get too much into the weeds, but there's actually a magazine cutoff. So you can turn this into a single shot with 5 rounds in reserve. And so you're actually like single loading each time you work the bolt, because the US still wasn't sure about letting people fire all those rounds, right? Like they were still pretty conservative logistically. But you can see this is gonna push up, there's a little spring there, and that's gonna force your rounds upwards. So you get 5 of those. It can actually load pretty quickly. You can load them one at a time, or you can use what they often call a stripper clip. So that's gonna hold, in this instance, 5 cartridges, and there's a groove right here machined into it. And you actually put that in there, and you do it right. Gotta practice more, it would have been a lot faster, right? But then you pull that out, and then you've got 5 rounds in there. So it's pretty fast, right? You can reload these pretty quickly, and fire pretty rapidly with accuracy, right? So it's a good firearm. But by the early 1900s even, there's what the military is thinking would be a better mechanism for loading this thing, right? And so there's just not quite the models out there that are strong enough or simple enough for military use. So what do you think? What is that method or mechanism?
I assume it's the firing mechanism.
Yeah, so it's similar to that. It's essentially the loading mechanism, right? So what they're thinking about is semi-automatic. So that's each pull of the trigger, right? The gun actually does all the work for you, and extracts and then loads itself just by you pulling the trigger.
Firing.
What's
Electric.
that?
It's like there's electric firing.
Yeah, a little bit,
like
right?
that.
So it's kind of crazy. So there's different methods of doing it, right? Sometimes it's actually they use the force of that explosion, and parts like the barrel sometimes will actually like move slightly, and then create enough force to like shove that whole mechanism to the rear. Another way, and the way that this one works is through gas. And we'll get into that a little bit, but essentially what's happening is the US sees this, and these semi-automatics are being invented, right? They're out there. They're used for hunting. They're used in World War I mostly by the air forces or the Army Air Forces, depending on where they're at, of different countries, because you can fire faster and reload less with these things when you're flying around in biplanes shooting at each other, right? But they're complicated if they get dirty. They don't work very well. They're pretty fragile. Some of them don't fire these big military cartridges very well. They'll fire like shorter, like hunting rounds, and the hunting firearms are only designed to fire like 1 or 2 shots at a time. So they're not sturdy enough. But the U.S. and a lot of other countries are seeing this, and so in America they decide we need to get some of these, but we have to design them, right? And so they actually hire a guy in 1919 named John Moran. He's a Canadian that moves to the U.S. and is working there, and he is hired here, and his job is to start coming up with semi-automatic designs. And there are some different folks that are actually doing kind of similar things along with him. And at one point they have like these competing designs that the U.S. is testing back and forth. But a lot of what it comes down to is they're looking at like different mechanisms of different designs and sort of filtering all that and coming up with their own. And he's actually, we have a neat section in the back there where you can see like this sort of development of these different rifles that he's slowly creating, and they're saying, it's not quite what we're looking for, like keep thinking about it, right? And eventually though, in 1936, this design right here sort of wins adoption by the United States. And so they adopt it, and then they decide to call it the M1. So they're getting away from that like year designation of like the 1903, the 1892, and they start out like kind of from scratch. And they say this is the M1, right? And so that's 36, and then so this is essentially becomes the main rifle for the U.S. military during World War II, right? So it's like just before that time period, and they're able to kind of phase out the 1903, and they actually, I suspect, saw a little bit of, they saw World War II coming, even though the U.S. wasn't involved in it until later, and they built a big facility across the street in to start production of the M1. So they were able to pick up production pretty fast. And so the way that this rifle works is it's semi-automatic. So we have to have something to actually make it so that we don't have to be pulling on this, right, and slamming it forward again. And what John Graham uses is gas. He says all that gas that's shooting out of the end of the barrel, a lot of that's getting wasted, right? We can reuse that. And other people have used, it's not like the new, only, he's not the first guy to think of this, but his method is pretty simple and pretty ingenious. So he says, all right, and it's like the design process of this was lengthy and complicated, so I don't mean to like minimize it by any means, but what happens is that it becomes, in usage, a pretty simple mechanism. It's actually a little bit complicated to build so that it all works correctly, but it ends up that it does work very well. And so he uses gas, and so he drills a hole in the bottom of the barrel, and some of that gas is redirected into basically a piston system. And so that gas shoots downwards, and this, now instead of a bolt, right, this is called a charging handle. It's connected, it comes up here, and it actually kind of doglegs up and goes inside this gas system, and it's called, at that point it's called an operating rod. And it goes up like pretty far, and the gas is what's shoving that to the rear. And so that actually makes the mechanism go down, and when it's unloaded, it locks like that. When it is time to go forward, when there's ammunition in there, a spring also wrapped around this operating rod slams it forward. And if you guys want, I'll hold this, you can kind of push down on this, you can see it's like a pretty stiff spring that you're operating against there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there's a lot there. I will give you guys, so we're looking at the spring tension. This, if you want, you can pull down on that a little bit and kind of get an idea of like how much spring tension we're talking about.
Sorry.
No, you're good. That's what it's designed for.
Yeah, it should be
Look at
locked,
that, see?
and then you will trigger.
No, that's exactly what. Yeah. I got to be careful because it didn't quite lock, so if I stick my fingers in there, it gives me a little.
Get your grand bone.
Yeah, we got a ringer over here, huh? All right, good. So we were just talking about like the gas system. So this is like the gas getting shoved downwards and pushing this mechanism down against the spring tension. And what ends up happening in World War II, which is really the first use of this, is the primary combatants, right? Again, with the U.S. are Germany and Japan, right? And so Germany and Japan are actually both using firearms just like this 1903, right? And we talked about earlier This rifle is actually based on a German design that they, after the 1890s, modified slightly, but used basically the same thing. So now these countries are using 5-round bolt-action rifles, right? Well made, accurate, still pretty fast to aim and fire, but now the U.S. is using a semi-automatic rifle that actually holds 8 rounds. Doesn't seem like a lot, right? But you have 3 extra rounds to fire before you have to start the whole process over again. And this one's a little weird. John Grant, there's already like detachable magazines out there, right? So that exists, that's a thing. Garand decides not to do that. He actually goes with kind of an old school design that people were using with bolt action rifles. And he takes what's called, sometimes people call it a charger. In this instance, they refer to it as an N-block clip. So here's a little nomenclature for you. But that's what you actually fill your rounds. I can pass that around. So it's a piece of spring steel. And what it's doing is when you have 8 in there, it pins them all together. If you load 5 or 6 or 7, they actually all come like falling out of it.
So this one is like metal. It's metal, yeah.
Exactly. And so you have to have 8, which is kind of, you know, in a detachable magazine or a something like that, you can load, you know, if it's a 20-round magazine, you can load 1. You can load 2, you can load 5. In this instance, you have to have 8. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And so I've got, conveniently enough, 8 right here. So when we open this up, you're going to see there's a pretty good idea, right? So there's these protrusions on either side of this thing. You see that? And there's some grooves machined in here that correspond to those protrusions. So I can load this, and typically, yeah, good, okay. It's all set up. So they're kind of staggered, right? You see that? So I can load them in there either like that or like that. There's no up or down, so that's convenient. And when I do this, I'm going to push these down. They're actually going to unlock this charging handle. And so that's where the term grand thumb there. When you don't hold back the charging handle and your thumb gets stuffed in there, it'll slam forward really fast sometimes. So what a lot of folks do is you take your hand, you make a blade of it essentially, and you're going to stop that from going out. So I'm going to push it down, and you're going to hear a little bit of a click. Right? And then it released. And now the only thing that's keeping it from going forward, other than my hand right now, is the spring tension of that first cartridge. So sometimes it needs a little help. And there it goes. And so now it's ready to fire. There's a safety right here. So it's this is on fire. When we push it like that, right there, it's on safe. It's actually kind of interesting. Some people don't like this because your finger, you know, has to be in the trigger guard to know if it's safe for fire. But I think for military purposes, it's pretty good because you don't have to look, right? You put your finger in there, and we know it's on safe, and we can simply flick it forward, and now it's ready to fire. And when you go to fire, right? So you would fire, you would pull the trigger. You're going to aim down. There's a circular rear sight, and you're going to look through it and match it up with this blade front sight. And when you do that, you're going to fire. You're going to pull the trigger, and this mechanism is going to do all the work. And so then you'll have a little bit of recoil, but essentially you can keep your face there, aiming and firing, right, each time. Whereas with the bolt action, you actually have to remove your cheek, pull the bolt back and forward, and put it back again. So you do have some speed, and you can have accurate, aimed fire pretty rapidly with one of these. Same cartridge, so same 30-06 is this, so you have that same distance, that same power. And it's pretty comparable with like a lot of other military cartridges of the time period. So that's what's happening. So this is kind of neat. So if we do this, right? So say I fired it. There's a hammer in here that's going to snap forward, hit the back of this bolt. There's a pin in there that's going to slam forward again, hit the primer in the bottom of that cartridge, ignite the gunpowder. We go from solid to gas, right? It's now pushing that projectile out. Projectile goes out. At the same time, the gas goes down here, slams to the rear, knocks that charging handle back. The empty one comes out, the new one's loaded. And that can happen 8 times. Now, one of the downfalls of this loading system, right, is that I need like 3 arms and gorilla strength to like actually top off. Say I shoot 2 or 3 rounds and we stop for a little while, but I know I'm gonna have to fight again. I can't just reload my ammunition in there very easily. So what you would do is I'd have to pull this out. You can actually manually have this thing go shooting out. So there's a button right here, so when I push this button, this thing's gonna go flying out. It stays locked. What's gonna happen is after I shoot my 8th round, that same thing is essentially gonna happen. So I'll do that. This, we put a little block in there so that replicates having some ammunition in it. All right. There we go. I'll have this thing go flying out. All right, so kind of goes flying, so be aware of it. So it's gonna happen, I shoot my last round, that goes flying out, this stays to the rear. I just saw that come shooting out in front of my face. I know I'm out, and then I have to reload. So a little archaic, right, compared to modern military rifles, but for 1936 and into the 40s, this is pretty high-powered stuff. The really neat thing I think about this, and I'll show this to you, is how simple it is. Okay, so I'm just going to break it down into like some major component parts, and sort of the competitors for design and like the other semi-automatic rifles at the time, pretty complicated. All right, so there was dozens and dozens of different parts, and they worked in sort of complicated, finicky ways. This thing, if I want to take it apart, I have the bolt forward, it's cocked, which means that the hammer is back, and I'll show you what that means even. But now, I'm simply going to take my trigger guard, I'm going to pull it to the rear and up. And the whole mechanism comes out. And that's that hammer, this thing right here. That's what's going to, when I pull the trigger, that's what shoots forward. And it hits the rear of the bolt. So I want to be careful because the safety is off and this is cocked. And I had a coworker, I came out one time and I saw this like blood on the floor. And I was like, holy cow, what's going on out here? And he's sitting there, his hand's all wrapped up. And he's like, I got my finger pinched in this. So that tells you like how much force is he doesn't work here now, so it's not nobody here. Don't make fun of any of them. They're pretty good. And now let's say, okay, I want to take this apart a little further. Give that a tap. The whole stock just comes right off. And now we can see this whole thing. I'm not going to take it too much further apart. I'll take it a little bit apart here, but you can see how that works. That's actually where the I'll pull it back so you can see. So when I pull this back, you can see, right? See that whole thing move? Right there, that's that operating rod we were talking about. We lock it back. So this is where the ammunition sits inside this thing. So you can see that. And so now this is the crazy part, right? So the spring that's in here, that's forcing this to go forward, is the same spring that's pushing up on the ammunition to bring it up each time. There's a little mechanical system right here. See that thing move? That's all hooked up, so that's actually pushing on the spring. So you've got one spring doing double duty there, which is pretty ingenious because when you start getting all kinds of coil springs and different things, like they get lost, they lose tension, things like that. So the more you can simplify, the better. So that's pretty good. And then for the gas system, we'll check that out. Normally, you'd want this on really tight because it actually really affects your repeatability of your accuracy if this is like rattling around. But we don't shoot this, so I just go like that. The other thing is, in the butt, if you do have to take your gas system apart, that's a side note, in the stock is oil and a tool
that allows you to do that. So you have these things like stored in there, which is pretty handy dandy. All right, right there. So, all right, so I can pull this off. Right there. I unscrew this and drop the barrel. And then you can actually see this whole system, right? Ooh, there it goes. And so that's what's holding that gas in there. You can see the hole right there. It's not very big. That all that gas is coming through. And that's what's pushing this whole thing to the rear. So when this goes forward, see that? So this is just basically getting shoved down with that spring, and you can see the spring right there. It's pretty long. It's actually a pretty long spring wrapped around that thing. So, you know, you take this further apart, this bolt comes out, so like that, but that gives you the idea, right? That's basically, you'd pull the bolt out, and that's field stripped, and you would clean it all down, and the whole trigger assembly, which, you know, they didn't want soldiers messing around in there. You can wipe it off, clean it real quick, and it's all in like one piece, and then you just put it back together. So it's a really simple firearm when it comes down to it. The genius of it, I think, is that it all works, right? And there's been some instances where they, if you have like some of the elements of it, if they're not made exactly right, like it doesn't work right all the time. So the genius is like the interchangeability aspect, and the fact that it does have like fairly high standards of manufacture. So it's not necessarily a simple thing to manufacture, but it turns into a really simple mechanism once you've done it. So I think that's the genius of it right there. And so this thing, you know, it's not the thing that wins a war, but it definitely gives your infantry advantages in the rate of fire and the amount of ammunition that they have, as well as because it is reliable and seen as a more advanced and better rifle in a lot of ways than this type, gives your soldiers a lot of confidence in their firearm as well, right? So all kinds of accounts out there of people, you know, people can't talk enough about the M1, right? It's like there are some instances where it will fail, but that's pretty rare, which you can't always say about these early semi-automatic rifles. So, and when I want to put it back together, I go like that. Trickiest part is making sure that this, right, where it mates up just right. Ready to go. So that's pretty slick. So it sea service, World War II. The Marines are still using 1903 rifles for the initial part of that war. Part of that is the Marines always seem to be like the last ones to get anything. The other part is that the Marines were still, you know, they're riflemen, and this is a very accurate, very well-regarded rifle. They didn't necessarily want to change to this new thing, but that did happen in the course of the war. Some of that was that they actually saw that, hey, this is just as accurate and just as good, right? Just because it's newer doesn't mean that it's worse. So by the end of the war, pretty much every infantry trooper is armed with one of these. In the Korean War, we actually never came up with anything different. So in Korea, this is your main battle rifle. By Vietnam, these have been superseded by another rifle, but they're still around. And they see after the World War II, you know, the Armory made 4.5 million of these things. And then there's contractors that made quite a number also. so a lot of these, because what's the big conflict post World War II, right? What's the global sort of issue that is going on? The Cold War, yeah, right? So what the United States does is you have a Europe kind of that's wrecked, right? Most of the world. And so the United States actually is trying to rebuild some of this, and then all of a sudden you have this sort of dividing line, right, between ideologies. And so the United States gives their cells pretty cheaply, a lot of these, to a lot of countries, a lot of militaries all across the globe. And so this becomes a sort of worldwide rifle in the hands of what eventually becomes NATO. Countries, as they rebuild, start to phase these out and have more advanced weapons, but there's quite a few of them out there. And so it becomes pretty ubiquitous. That, and actually, I just talked with a couple months ago now, I talked with a guy that was in the military, and he said they captured M1s in Iraq in the mid-20 teens or something like that. So they're still in use by combatants out there, which I think is a testament to the simplicity and durability of these things that they're out there. So yeah, so that's the M1, primarily, made the most numbers here, right, actually across the street, but a number of contractors did produce these into the Korean War. And it was the U.S.'s, probably in my view, like one of the few times, in all honesty, that U.S. small arms are actually at the cutting edge of development when they're issued. Probably one of the only times that happens up until now, right? A lot of times we're sort of reworking European designs, but in this case, we're at the cutting edge. So that's the M1. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah.
God bless. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You too. You guys have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, okay. All this thing. Now we'll go back to their chatter and watch a short video on Springfield Armory.
On the Mill River,
Yeah.
assembly, testing, and
pwede kang-
storage were accomplished in a large square of brick buildings built on a
will
hill
watch-
above the river. Springfield Armory played a key role in creating early standards of tolerance
babay na muna.
engagement. This is the final inspection. As the War Department began contracting for rifles from private armories,
Okay, bye.
inspectors from Springfield ensured that contractors met rigid requirements.
Nothing leaves this room until it fits. Here.
This interaction between Springfield Armory and these private contractors sparked an exchange of ideas and innovations that fostered a quantum leap in precision machining. Springfield Armory was, for a time, in the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, pioneering the equipment and many of the systems that were the foundations of mass production. The mission of the Armory, set in 1794, was to provide the Army with arms in peacetime, to establish a reserve, and to prepare for rapid increase of output in case of war. The Civil War tested the mettle of Springfield Armory. From their protected location, deep in the northern states, Springfield Armory produced a dependable and ever-increasing number of quality weapons. Output of muskets multiplied in a single year from less than 14,000 in 1861 to over 100,000 in 1862, and to double that again in 1863. center for testing and developing a variety of weapons and accessories. Smokeless powder, magazine feeds, and longer-range ammunition created the need for a basic weapon that would incorporate these advantages. The Ordnance Department made a concerted effort to develop a new basic military rifle. The weapon finally developed by Springfield, the 1903 Springfield, or the 03. During World War I, 250,000 03 Springfields were produced for our soldiers, far less than were needed. Lack of funding in the years before the war had slowed the institution's response time. The quality of the 03 Springfield became legendary. It was one of the most dependable, sturdy, accurate, and effective weapons ever mass-produced. This evolution continued after the First World War with competition to produce a semi-automatic rifle for the military, a weapon that would reload itself using the energy created by the discharge of the previous round. The design finally chosen for production was that of a civilian worker at the Armory, Canadian-born John Garand. Between 1940 and the end of the war, 4.5 million Garands poured off the assembly lines. The man with the famous last name preferred to remain anonymous, frequently saying, "My gun speaks loud enough for both of us." Secretary of Defense McNamara decided that private suppliers could provide the necessary weapons. In 1968, after 174 years of operation, Springfield Armory was closed.
Okay guys, we're done watching their short video. So after that, you can see their gift shop that sells souvenir items. Okay guys, we're done here in Springfield Armory. Hope you like this video and learn something from it. If you have any question, please comment down below and please do subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. See you in my next one. Bye. God bless us all.